And how are you this fine, fine holiday week, Cameron?
I'm doing well, good to be in the studio, my friend. Yes, this is a holiday week, but we get to observe the holiday in December. I get to enjoy it later in the year. I guess delayed gratification or whatever they would call that is what we get
I
to
imagine
enjoy.
we've all thoroughly confused everybody by referring to this as a holiday week. But we are technically live streaming on President's Day, which makes it a holiday and a holiday week for our international audience. I was actually going to insert a joke here, but I realized it's probably not an appropriate joke for the Zero Attraction podcast.
There we go.
So I
Maybe
will,
we
yes, we'll just kind of silence it there and just say that today we're honoring those on Mount Rushmore. Is what we're is what we're after today. Um, but with that, welcome to Zero to Traction, a podcast by how first-time founders create companies at scale. Your regular co-host coming at you, JDM and Cam, Josh David Miller, my buddy Cameron Law. Cameron, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm always excited to be in the studio and yeah, looking forward to another week of supporting startups. So looking forward to hopping on in.
Yeah, well, we're here to flex our startup muscles. We are here to engage in the podcasting workout. Get your brains really moving. Hop on the elliptical of traction. And if you're wondering why I'm doing so many of these terrible similes, it is because we're coming at you with an edition that we are calling the "Are You Doing Reps or Just Posing" edition of Zero to Traction. And like let's do some level setting here. I'll go ahead and take it. So it's actually this fitness metaphor is one that has come up a lot. I know, Cameron, it's been one that you've liked to use quite a bit lately, and it actually seems really apropos. And it's this idea that you know as startup founders, we have a lot of work that we're engaging in, and that there's high value work, there's low value work, and we've talked like a ton on this podcast about how to tell the difference between those two work. And we talked a little bit, I think, on last week's show. I think it was last week's show on this idea of getting good at the thing before trying to like really scale it. It's like this idea of we have this you know uh skill set of experimenting and learning how to how to translate assumptions into really good hypotheses, and hypotheses into really good experiments, and experiments into really good analysis, and kind of engaging that in the loop. But if you kind of go through that in a really shallow fashion, then you're kind of going through the motions, but the reps don't really matter for very much. And so it's this idea of like, you can't really focus. It's like premature scaling in a sense, right? It's like trying to focus on getting through as many reps as possible before you've mastered the actual motion, before you've mastered that itself. This is kind of like a really broad topic too, because we can even talk about like use the same metaphor, this idea of like reps versus posing, is that oftentimes what we see is as founders putting on the motions, but almost as a performance. And I don't mean this as like, hopping on stage in a black turtleneck and calling yourself Steve Jobs kind of performance. Although it's unlikely we'll get through this podcast without us throwing some shade on the founders who do that. But it's more that the performance aspect of this is to try to focus on how we talk about the business as if that's solving the problem of the business. And this has been a recurring theme for a while. We spoke a few weeks ago, Cameron, about this like levels of feedback that you can get from investors, and how it's all couched in like performance or communication skills type stuff. Like, I didn't understand what you meant by, or can you explain how this would, when really it's questions about like, hey, you don't have a go-to-market strategy there, bruh. Right. And but it's couched in this communication. So we can get stuck in that. And so that leads us to just constantly and continuously, incessantly just going through the motions, which at the end of the day is actually the fundamental equivalent of striking up what we think is a brilliant yoga pose, catching ourselves in that gym mirror while everyone around us is trying their best not to point, laugh, and stare while secretly filming you on their phone for part of their latest reel. Um, with that, context has been set. Um, hopefully that made some sense. Uh, I've just put a lot on the table, like, to some different ways to test this, but I know, Cameron, you had some things you wanted to,
Yeah.
yeah, move the
I
pieces
think,
around, grab a piece, pick it up, stare at it. Let's go.
yeah, I think, where my like first kind of thought process, I have kind of two things that come to mind. One is like the posing aspect and what that might look like in the analogy I'll dive into in a second will be kind of like the golf world there. And then the other I want to dive into is related to kind of building that muscle of kind of doing things that matter that will help you build the engine for ultimately scaling. And that's more tied to like when I think of like training for a marathon and base building and like how you need to like actually build the base before you fully go, before you get hurt because you tried to run too far with not having the foundation to do so. So related to kind of the golf example, I think of, oftentimes there's the golfer who, and I could say I might be one of these individuals who, has decent clubs and looks the part, but you're like, wow, that person must be a really good golfer. And like what comes to mind is someone who has like a really polished pitch deck. They have like, it looks really nice. They have all the advisors, but then when you get into the actual discussion about the mechanics of the business and understanding the nuances of what you're doing to gain evidence and getting to actual traction, they see your swing and it's like, whoa, you're shooting over 100, on the golf course there. And so it's like, you haven't really, the perception of what's showed is like a major miss versus, demonstrating that, hey, I don't have all of these things pieced together, but I'm putting the right actions into motion to actually gain that evidence, right? And so it's not about having this visual representation that I'm the entrepreneur that has this beautiful pitch deck and I'm telling the right story, but I don't actually have the like model that goes along with that. And so that was kind of one of the areas that I thought maybe we could break down what that actually looks like. And then the other track of thinking was related to really doing the right activities and building this foundation for actually getting to scale. And we often talk about like, how do we start tackling our riskiest assumptions and actually building experiments to gain validation? So then we build this strong foundation of our engine that when we do get in front of the right customers, we know what that repetition ultimately looks like to then ultimately be able to scale versus, oftentimes what I would say is like the person who's maybe hasn't fully built the base, but they start running, they're training for their marathon and they're like, you know what, I'm feeling good and I'm going to just go run a half marathon tomorrow, even though I haven't done the proper work to do so. Because that's not going to scale because by the time you get into week 2, 3, 4 of that training, you're going to likely get hurt because you don't have the foundation to do so. And that might be the same of having, hey, I get to revenue, but it's not actually a repeatable process. They don't have that's actually not my early adopter customer. And I've over engineered my product and service to then be able to cater to that. And now when I go to scale, the investment resources that I bring on don't actually scale alongside that process. And then the engine breaks. And then ultimately, you might be more challenged. And so those are kind of the two specific, I guess, sport related examples if we're bringing in, sports and activities and what that looks like to us. And I'll pass the golf ball over there or see where you want to take any of those thoughts, JDM.
No, I think it's great. Let's just take them in order. So, the first one, this idea of, I think focusing on the communicative aspects, right, of the startup, over the analytic aspects of the business, I guess
Yeah.
you'd say. Um, like we started, you and I were actually having a discussion, just shortly before we started recording here about one of the startups that we've been working with, and this is not to knock on them because the founders are actually super cool and they're working on something that's interesting and all that. But there's a tendency, to when you're in the early stages, right? When you're pre-seed, pre-revenue, and you're trying to figure out like where the there is, right? So like it seems like there's a there. There's like a market opportunity, but we don't really know where there is yet. So we can't say is there a there because we're still, trying to figure out where there even is, like where it would even be to look. And so you come up with a reasonable hypothesis, and as you start pitching and like going through the process, like the motions of a startup, then you start to define negative space. And this is totally normal, right? So like the there's this old thing I haven't talked about in a while, so I'm probably going to bungle this a little bit. This is one of those things that I would just like trot out once a week. Um, and so I'll do my best. I'll do my best here, but like, it's this idea of, failure being data and failure being learning. And that's all very true. But what that is from a practical perspective is saying that like, we think that the right place to be is over there somewhere. Right. And so we're going to start heading in that direction. And we like to set up this concept of a bullseye, right? That there's like a target that we're going to hit. And but there's no such thing as a bullseye in startups. Like that's not a thing. But at least it defines where we're kind of heading, right? But if we're off 20% in one direction or 20% in the other direction, like, hey, we're still successful, still a huge win. It didn't matter that we hit the target. But the benefit of defining the target in the first place wasn't whether it was right or wrong. It was what I like to say is directionally accurate. Because if you think about it like a circle, right? And if you're standing in the center of the circle and along somewhere around the circumference of the circle is where you drew that target, 20% up, 20% down, you've actually taken 60% of that circle and said it's not over there. Right. And that's
Right.
amazing, right? That's huge, right? You've just taken all this emptiness off the table. So you have to find this negative space. Then as we start going from the center of the circle toward that target, and this is where we end up in like the Damian Newman, design swiggle facing the wrong way at one point, kind of, flipping around and up and down and sideways, backward and forth on our way toward the target. And as we start doing that, what we're doing is saying like, all right, we're going to practice the fundamental essence of science, which is, I think it's over there. Here's an experiment. Let's run it. Whoop, that wasn't it. Right. And say, oh, actually, wait, this was interesting. This actually worked out. Okay. Let's take a look at oh, nope, not quite there. Oh, it's over here. Right. And it's this constant idea of failure. And that idea of failure is defining that more of that negative space, getting more precise from that 20% above and 20% below, and just getting more and more precise on that negative space. But the experience of that negative space, the definition of that negative space is the experience we call failure, right? Like that's literally how it works. Or put a little bit more elegantly, the French philosopher, physicist, Bernard Despaigne, from his book on physics and philosophy. This was, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, something like that. Anyway, super fascinating, super interesting book, really heady stuff. So you have to kind of be signed up for that. But anyway, he has this great quote in early on in the book, I think maybe in like the preface, where he says, nature refuses to tell us what she is, but if we press her tenaciously enough, she will condescend to tell us a little bit about what she is not. Right. And that's the fundamental nature of the scientific endeavor is we can't say, I think it's X. Let's test if it's X. All we can say is, I think it's X, which if it is, we will see this. And all we can do is tell it to prove us wrong. Right. And then by it proving us wrong is us defining that negative space, which is the experience we call failure. Right. So that's what we're actually trying fundamentally to do. Right. Is define that negative space. Well, the problem is like when you're really in the early stages and you're doing that awesome, great work, fundamentally from week to week, you can face a different direction than you were facing before. Not 100% different, like it's recognizably the same thing, but it's when like, I'm sure you guys have all seen this, when you see somebody's pitch and then maybe 6 months later, you see their pitch again and it's recognizably the same business, but you're like, but you go, oh, now you're doing this. Right. And that's because they've just gone through that natural, like little bit of pivot. Well, so the problem, like bringing this back to the conversation that we were having with these early stage founders is like going through that very normal, very useful, very awesome work. And while you're going through that process, we have a tendency to default to thinking about the change itself as a change in the pitch. Right. Or as a change in the communication, a change in how we talk about it, as opposed to this fundamental thing. So we were actually like doing pitch review with this company, with these founders, and they were saying it was something a bit different than where we ended up at the end of the conversation. And so where they ended up was like super exciting, super interesting, about 400 million questions, but like, hey, that's it. That's super interesting. And so they were like, now help us incorporate this in the deck. And we were like, but we can't incorporate, like, what are we incorporating in the deck? We don't know what this thing is yet. So maybe you want to expand on that, like scenario a little bit more, Cameron.
Yeah. So I think to that point, the question kind of goes to, it's not about plugging it into the deck. It's about how do we then go validate this new concept in the market and what are the assumptions we have around it, right? And a key component is Josh and I aren't going to be the ones to be saying, yeah, that's the right answer because we're not the customer of the solution and nor really can say yes or no in that decision. And so it's part of it is uh, what now do we need to go test and define out that negative space, or also say this is actually what is true. And once we identify and validate this concept, now that's a new building block within this model, and how therefore do all these other things change. So if it's now we've defined that we still have the same customer, but we're offering a new solution that offers some new value. How do we then change the language that resonates with them, or does it maybe change the how we get this in front of them because it looks differently or would be engaged in differently? And so that's how then we can incorporate it into the pitch. But it's really more about how does the model shift based on the evidence that we're getting or lack thereof from the marketplace.
So great. So build on that a little bit, Cam. So like we titled this episode like the "Are you doing reps or just posing?" edition. So bring that metaphor in here, like kind of wrap a little bit on that.
Yeah, so I think what when we're thinking about like the idea of doing reps versus kind of posing, right? The posing mentality would be like, oh, I'm just going to put this new concept into my deck. I'm going to throw this idea out there, and I'm going to test to see if the judges like it. And again, part of it is you're going to get feedback that's coming as a top of the triangle, as we would say, of like they're communicating on performance or communication, but you're communicating something that's actually a fundamental shift in your business model that you don't have evidence for. And so the activity in building the repetitions is actually going and saying, how do I break this down? And one, understand what assumption I am kind of now grappling with based on this new idea, or how this is changing our business model. And then how can I set up an experiment and build that repetition to then be able to ultimately gain that evidence that then ultimately proves out or disproves that this should be the way that we're approaching building our business. And so it's not about going and telling the story of like, hey, I got this new idea for a gym routine. It's actually going and doing the gym routine and seeing the change that makes for you and your business, and that's actually proving out. And then therefore things will start to shift in the overall venture.
Yeah, I think to kind of build on that a little bit. So I agree with all of it. So I'm not going to revise or disagree. I'll just kind of pile on.
Yeah, please.
Is I often tell founders that when you're pitching for investment, you're not pitching for investment. You're pitching for another meeting, right? And that's the idea that like these singular points in time, are singular points in time. And then I think Cam, you showed you threw to me that our one of the unicorn founders in the Sacramento region that we both know, named Brandon Brown from Grin.co. He had shared this like super simple metaphor that I thought was really awesome, which was it was a line graph. And it was a just basic XY. I don't even think they were labeled. I don't think the axes were even labeled on it. But it just showed a few dots graphed on there, and then a trend line through the dots. And the trend line was kind of ticking upward, of course, right? So it was it had a positive slope, even though it was linear, but it had a positive slope. And so the basic point that Brandon was making was that people don't invest in data points; they invest in trend lines. And I don't remember exactly the terms he used. I don't think he was as mathy as I was with it there, but they're like that's the same idea here, right? Is that nobody's investing in a single data point. A pitch is a single data point, right? All of the experiments that you run are single data points. The customers that you get, the partnerships that you get, the investors, advisors, mentors that you get along the way, the accelerator programs that you're in. Those are all individual data points, but nobody's investing in a data point. They're investing in the trend line, and it's the trend line going in the right direction. And so if you go back to, what you were just saying a second ago, Cam, like of this reps that you have to put in, this work that you have to do, even if you get like this great sounding pitch, and even if you can overcome that you just made it up, right? That there's nothing behind it, it's still a single data point. And the trend line still needs to be going toward this being a scalable business, which means that you need to have all the little points, generally speaking, sloping up, right? It just needs to be going in that direction. And so, um, all the work that you have to be doing needs to be building in that direction. It needs to be getting you up and over on the XY axis. You have to run experiments that are giving. That doesn't mean they all 100% need to be positive. It doesn't mean that there aren't pivots. It doesn't mean that you aren't wrong. All those things are going to happen anyway. But the general trend line needs to be toward the target, right? Toward the thing that we're saying that we could deliver on over time. And that's what the reps do. The reps
Yeah.
get you there.
Well, I think that's actually like a good transition to kind of our second element. And if there's something else you wanted to pinpoint there,
No,
but
go
I'm
for it.
thinking as like, the other kind of topic was, the concept of like base building to get to kind of your end goal, I guess each segment of your, I guess maybe fundraising process, maybe you could look at it. But you do need that trend line of continuing to demonstrate evidence that you're progressing in the right direction. And we'll have to share the visual in the show notes because I think it is valuable for, sometimes the data points are higher, sometimes they're lower, but they're all headed in the general direction. And your job is to demonstrate that progress towards that overall action. But as we're thinking about kind of this concept of base building, if you're going from here to then this like huge high data point, the trend line needs to continue in that direction. So if you then have a conversation, the next quarter and it's like way down because weren't doing the right, you didn't, properly build the right engine, or you over engineered a sale and you can't actually deliver the value proposition that you set out to deliver, right? Those things can ultimately shift what that data point and overall trend line progress looks like. And so at that kind of foundational level, it's really about building that kind of initial engine. And we often, we talk a lot about that revenue is a lagging indicator. And so a lot of it is like, as you're building these initial reps and evidence, is what are those leading indicators that are going to signal down the line that you're continuing to see that progress later on, and that you're ultimately building those dots. And so it's not that I have this huge pipeline. It's, well, how are you qualifying this pipeline based on them getting into the pipeline and them actually being your early adopter, and that the conversion rate is going to be X, right? And so really breaking that down. And that's kind of what that base building activity is. And so it's like, oh, we've done all these kind of, less glamorous things because maybe you're not at revenue yet, but you're actually building kind of this foundational engine that you then can say, hey, based on our theory that once we get to these conversion rates, we're going to hit this revenue number. And then now you have that trending progress line that will ultimately allow you to secure the investment. And now they're investing in the thing that's growing versus things that might not be headed in that right general direction. So I wanted to just kind of transition to that component of thinking about like, how do we, what I'm equating in my brain as like base building for kind of the marathon of like, one, I need something that's sustainable, but I also need to know that like I can do this over a long period of time, and that like one, it's going to have the return to help me get to where I want to go, but also that this is something that we can add fuel on the fire once we get later on because we have a strong base to ultimately grow on.
Totally. And like, so something you just said kind of triggered in me this idea of outliers, right? Like any trend line has outliers. And if you come up with this brilliant idea for where you think the business can go, and it's awesome. And and you get this great feedback from investors. They're excited about it. This is interesting. Let's talk more, right? At that point, we don't know. There's no trend yet, right? There is just a data point that is interesting. And if you then, as you start diving in, go, oh, well, like we don't really have any evidence to support this. We go, oh, that was an outlier, right? Like that's not where this business isn't trending in this super cool, interesting direction. It's trending somewhere else. And I don't know if I'm into the other thing that it's trending. Um, and that's like sucky. But what came to mind when you were talking, Cameron, was like there's a reverse side to that too. Is that if something goes really wrong, that's off the trend line, right? Off the trend line in the terrible direction, that too can be an outlier, right? It's like these big failures that we have along the way, and you will have them. These big failures that you have along the way can also just be outliers. As long as we're trending in the right direction, as long as we're doing that, then that gives us the grace to fail sometimes at those things without necessarily affecting the entire trend line. So just kind of wanted to
Yeah.
offer that in
Well,
there.
the other kind of concept that comes to mind as I'm kind of I'm trying to relate some of this to my own like training journey, just because that's kind of how we've set up the conversation. But I go back to one of the quotes that I often hear you speak to, and if I say it, please correct me if I'm wrong. But was, proportion your effort to the evidence that you have, and so like I think of, one, say training was, you need to proportion your evidence to like where you're at in that journey, right? If you're on, week one of your 18 training day block, you're not going to like go all out when you have to get to this point much later on. And so it's about how do I, not like not do anything, but I also need to know that I have the foundation to get to this point. And that's similar early on was like, you don't need to go run these huge sophisticated tests. It's about gaining that early evidence, and those might be cheaper experiments to ultimately be running and tying into. And so thinking about some of those elements of how you're actually investing your time and resources into building this early engine. You don't have to go run all these sophisticated things if you're not fully there in terms of the evidence that you have to back that up.
Totally. And so, like, let's tie that then back to this second point that you were saying, right? Of when we are attempting to validate the thing or just make progress, just do the thing that is running a startup, the fundamental activities, the reps that we need to put in are the experiments. And that word, I think, gets a lot of founders in trouble internally, like in their internal cognition, they get in trouble with that word because it seems, I think, simultaneously over engineering and simultaneously too rudimentary. Right. And so like those two things can't both be true. But I think a lot of times, founders are like, oh, I just want to test this thing. I don't want to go through all this formalism of defining this experiment, doing all that. And then on the flip side, they're also like, we're just trying to make progress. We just want to grow this thing. Like we're not going to run little experiments. We're not at that stage. But I think both of those two things can't be true at the same time. But instead of using the word experiment, maybe it would be better for us to pick a different word. I don't know but we'll just call it reps. Cycles, I think, is the word that we use a lot internally at the Traction Lab, but the premise is the same. The idea is build, measure, learn. The idea is we're going to go engage in some activities. And while we're engaging those activities, we're going to be watching for certain signals. And when we measure those signals, we're going to want to be able to unambiguously say whether we were right or wrong about them. And then either way, whether we were right or wrong about them, we're going to do something different because we got that data back, because we got that validated learning. We're going to make a decision to do something different, whether that is to double down or to pivot or persevere or whatever. So that basic cycle there, that big loop, let's go get data, let's hypothesize, get data from the market and then learn from it. That is the rep. That's the rep that we have to keep doing. And so the work over time of a startup founder is engaging in as many of those reps as possible. Now, I've said all of that like kind of casually, and I think it is important to go back and say like the formalism is important, I think, but we don't need to, for the sake of this conversation at least, go into all the detail about that formalism. That might make an interesting episode. But for now, it's just as simple as saying, this is what I think and how I know I'm right, right? I am right if. And
Well, yeah,
if you just freaking write that down before you do the effort, you'd be amazed at how much more you're able to learn. Just looking at seeing what happens just invites motivated reasoning. It just invites all of the cognitive biases that we as humans literally are not built to avoid.
right.
So why put yourself in that position?
I don't think you should.
Well
It,
said.
well, no, I mean, it goes back to kind of what you had shared earlier, was it helps define the negative space once you're right or wrong in that test. So just kind of pulling that back into conversation. But
Well, we could be talking about this all day, but this brings us to the end of our zero to traction time. No zero to traction would be complete without some frivolity. So, you want to go first?
sure, I don't have anything too frivolous. I guess what came to mind, just as you were asking me, I don't know if I share, but I each year I do a playlist, and I mentioned this in one of our podcasts. and I
No.
named the playlist on Spotify. So the I pick kind of a word or two words that kind of I set my like intentions or something around related to that, and so that's kind of what has been on my mind. And the two words that I chose this year were they're not as big of words as Josh usually uses. So he's got his big powerful language sometimes. But presence and sonder are the words. But the one I wanted to like highlight was sonder, and I think it's kind of interesting as it's like realizing that we all have our own like complex things going on in our life, and then that like the small things can make a dramatic difference. And the reason it was on my mind was I went for a run earlier today, and I there was like this big, I don't know if it was an acorn, but it was like this big thing that had fallen like right in the middle of the run pathway. I I passed it and I didn't like move it, and I was like, man, someone might hit this thing, and and I knew I was gonna loop back around, and it was still there, and I kicked it, but it was like, if you left it there, would someone have hit that? And then that whole day would have been dramatically shifted for, you know, thereon, right? So it's like I guess the butterfly effect from there. And so the reason I bring that in, just as entrepreneurs are solving real people's problems and having real conversations, and like you can dramatically make an impact. And so that's kind of a word that I'm holding true this year is the concept of sonder, and that little things can make a dramatic impact.
Awesome. Well, perhaps we'll put a link in the show notes to Cameron's playlist, a
Oh
Spotify
no, that'll be
playlist.
you'll know too much about me behind the scenes. So
You're
happy
always
to
DJing our events. How much does this mirror
not
what
not
you
not
how you
not very closely, but that's all right.
I'm just expecting like a playlist full of like Kendrick Lamar and Megan the Stallion. Am I on the right track
No,
here?
no, but it's definitely not the startup challenge, paradise EDM style music. So
Okay. Fair enough. Oh, well, for I don't have anything nearly as haughty as you had
whoa,
for your frivolous thought, but, for me, I'm just gonna round back to I think it was last week. I was saying that I had 1 episode left of Rings of Power, the Amazon Prime Lord of the Rings universe show. So I finished that out. And good and bad, right? So like we finally in the season 2 finale learn who the stranger is, and I did not like the answer. It was what I thought it was going to be, and I was really hoping that it wasn't going to be that. I won't spoil it for anybody, but it pissed me off. But at the same time, they did a very good job of rounding out some of the stories while naturally saying, "Oh, but we're just in the middle of this shit, yo." And then ending the season on a number of just completely open storylines, like, that are super, uh, consequential, right? It not a cliffhanger, like, when I was a kid and TV shows, like the weekly TV shows were a thing, before everything was on, streaming. The cliffhangers, like the season finale cliffhangers where so and so's life is in danger and dun 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 dun, and then the episode would be over. And they don't really do that anymore because I think
right.
it's lame. It's a product of the '90s and early 2000s, but and probably even before then. But um, the nature now is like we have all of these really interesting storylines that are just there waiting for us to explore. And I say all of that to say that I've also learned that it has yet to be renewed for a third season. So it's like reportedly maybe in pre-production, but it hasn't formally been renewed yet. So who knows if, when any of these storylines will be explored anywhere. So then I had to turn my attention to another a show on Apple TV Plus that I may have talked about this back before our Zero to Traction pause early last year. To which is called Slow Horses on
Great,
Apple TV Plus.
amazing
Fucking
show.
great show, right? And so, we paused when Liam was born because, like, we had just started the 2nd season because it had just come out, right? So we just started the 2nd season when Liam was born, and, then if for any of you who have kids out there, you will understand why we had to stop watching when Liam was born, and then we just tried to pick it up again a few months later, but we were so sleep deprived and, like, watching a half hour of TV at night and picking a show like Slow Horses just didn't really
Yeah.
work out
No.
that well. So we just now picked it up, and I'm now one episode away from the season 2 finale, but there's a season 3 that's waiting. And come for Gary Oldman, stay for Gary Oldman, and everything else is good too. Just
Yeah.
such a good show. You liked it too?
Oh, yeah. Katie and I loved it. So yeah.
Yeah, such a good show.
Thanks.
All right. Well, that takes us to the end of our time today. Yeah, thank you so much for listening. I always say the time is the one resource that you can never get back. So thank you for spending a little bit with us here today, even if you're multitasking, cooking some food, running on the treadmill, making your commute, whatever it is. We still appreciate you spending that time with us. Podcasts are everywhere. There is no shortage of podcasts, of white dudes talking at you for a while. So thank you for picking us. And if you did enjoy this, take a moment to like and subscribe wherever you like and subscribe. Write us a little review, good or bad. Leave it there. It really helps us. And if you are feeling ever so generous, then we'd love it if you just shared it with a friend. Share it on social, share it with a friend. Say, hey, I think you'd like this. Really appreciate it, because that's how podcasts grow, yo. So with that, Cameron, thanks for joining me this week.
Yeah. Thank you. And hope our trend line continue to go up with our listeners and downloads. So we, hope you can support us and growing the podcast.
There you go. All right.
Boom.
Peace out, man.
All right. See ya.
See ya.